Well, hello. My name is Dr. Ian Clary. I'm assistant professor of historical theology at Colorado Christian University, just outside of Denver. And I'm here with Dr. Brad Littlejohn. Bradford, thank you for taking the time to speak with me about this very, I think, important issue about COVID and lockdowns and what churches should do to respond to these things. You're a very uniquely positioned person to be speaking about these matters because of the role that you've had both in terms of the church and in terms of political theology over the last number of years. You being president of the Davenant Institute, of which I'm a former board member of, as well as the work you're doing in terms of research and writing for the Edmund Burke Foundation. So there's been lots of discussion online, in private, in public, about what churches should do in light of, does the government have a right to shut services down, whether for a short period of time or longer. And so I'm really excited to kind of get into these matters with you. I was saying this to you before we just started, but you've written a number of books in political theology. These two I have read, but I read a while ago. And now with all this stuff going on, as I've kind of dipped back into them, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how important both this book here, The Peril and Promise of Christian Liberty, is it saying here? It's backwards for me. And then your companion to Richard Hooker, published with Cascade. These are books that are really, really helpful to me. So anyway, with that long and awful introduction, I want us to kind of jump in and just start thinking about political theology and how this is relevant for what we're going through today.
Sure.
So sorry, that was a bit long-winded there. It's the Irish blood in me. So what I want to do is I kind of want to most of the Davenant people will be familiar with who you are, obviously, but my hope is that this discussion can kind of be broad-ranging. And I want people to kind of know a little bit about just your own interests in political theology and the Reformation. So I want to start with a question here for you, because this is something I think that you've been really helpful for me in terms of trying to think through. What is the magisterial Reformation? And second to that, how did you personally develop an interest? What was it that brought you to start thinking about, the magisterial Reformation is relevant for the 21st century?
Yeah, sure thing. So the magisterial Reformation, the term comes from the same root as the term magistrate. The magisterial Reformation was the Reformation that was in some ways under the authority of reforming civil magistrates, as opposed to the radical Reformation, which were the groups in the Reformation that tried to sort of create an independent free church that was separate from the authority of the civil magistrate. Now, from our standpoint now, we might be tempted to think the latter, those are the good guys, right? Those are, we value the freedom of separation of church and state, freedom of religion. We don't have the magistrate tell us what to do in the church, right? Or that's, of course, the question that we're wrestling with right now.
Right.
But historically, the main branches of the Reformation did come out of the magisterial Reformation. The Lutherans, Presbyterians, Dutch Reformed, Anglicans, all of the main groups came out of the magisterial Reformation. Even Baptists, as we know them now, are more products of the magisterial Reformed Baptists of the 17th century than they are of the 16th century Anabaptists. And I mean, the key point to note about, just to say very briefly about the magisterial Reformation, is it's sometimes thought, it's sort of unfortunate that the Reformation the reformers needed to make use of the civil magistrate to help them out. It was kind of a political necessity at the time just to protect them from persecution. But it was a kind of Faustian bargain whereby the purity of the Reformation was compromised. That's how people sometimes think of it.
That's how I thought about it in the past.
Yeah, and I think a lot of my work has been dedicated to explaining how, from the reformer standpoint, no, the role of the Christian magistrate as a Christian layperson was a fundamental part of recovering what they thought that the proper nature of the church was, and responding to the corruption that they saw in the structure of the papal church and the dangers that they saw in the radical Reformation churches. So, and a lot of my work has been also looking then at how do you get from that state church, state-supported church of the Reformation, to churches that are largely independent of the state today? Largely, but as we're seeing, not entirely. And I
Right.
think rightly not entirely so. So I think although the magisterial Reformation can seem very distant from the church as we understand it today, in fact, Protestantism is dependent upon it. And if you throw out certain assumptions of the magisterial Reformation, you end up with a kind of rampant individualism that has been very destructive to the church in America.
So it seems to me, in my reading of these matters, is that those early reformers, Protestants, will say, were trying to steer a course between a kind of like almost ecclesiastical tyranny on one side, and then the anarchy of the radical Reformation, the Anabaptists, what happened with that rebellion and that sort of thing. So like we're still, it feels like in this day, still trying to figure out that middle course, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I have, you can't see it, but on back here somewhere on a shelf, I've got Peter Leithart's book on Constantine. And when I flip in the acknowledgments of that book, I happen to notice the name of a guy named Brad Littlejohn in there. So that indicated to me that since that, at least that book's come out, you've had these interests. So how did you go from, being a student, was it New St. Andrews College, I guess you would have been at? How did you kind of get into this question? What was it that kind of tipped you off? Oh, these guys are actually really helpful for us.
Yeah, good. I mean, it was kind of by accident. I knew I was interested. I became increasingly interested in political theology and questions of how should we think of our role as Christian citizens. And growing up in America and the time, I guess, the sort of fading years of the religious right, and a lot of rhetoric about sort of a biblical approach to this political question or a biblical approach to that political question, and realizing how when you sort of looked under the surface, you often realized that the term biblical was just being used as kind of a branding label there,
Right.
and there was at least as good of a biblical argument often for the other position. So did that mean that the Bible didn't actually have anything useful to teach us about our politics? I didn't want to arrive at that conclusion, but I really wanted to wrestle with the question of how does the authority of Scripture guide our political engagement? And at the same time, I had become very interested in Reformation history. History was my first love, and I did a summer study program at Oxford, and I studied about English Reformation. So I just kind of put those two interests together for my graduate study and said, I want to look at political theology and the English Reformation. I want to look at the nature of scriptural authority and how that relates to political authority. But I didn't have a clear set of categories for sort of guiding me in that inquiry. And I didn't really know where I wanted to end up. And I didn't really understand the landscape until I began, I studied the work of Peter Martyr Vermigli and scholarship of Torrance Kirby, who particularly draws attention to this concept of the two kingdoms, not in the sense that term's often used now, but in the sense that the reformers meant the term. The way Vermigli talks about the two kingdoms, the two governments, the mutual subjection between ecclesiastical, spiritual, and civil rule. And then, more importantly, the work of Richard Hooker, which really connected the dots for me in important ways. So with those two figures, Vermigli and Hooker, I really began to understand the way that the reformers understood these different authorities. And just coming back to something you said earlier, it's the steering that middle course between ecclesiastical tyranny and anarchy. I think a lot of it comes down to that the reason they saw the role of the magistrate in the church as being important was because if everything, well, we can start with the anarchist side, right? If nothing in the church is subject to any kind of government, if everyone just says, oh, the Bible is our only authority, well, then we know where that leads, right? That leads to every individual has their own concept of what God requires, and it's impossible for the church to function as a community. On the other hand, if all of the affairs of the Christian life are to be, so you need some kind of human authority to govern affairs of the Christian life. But if all of those are governed by church leaders, by theologians, by the clergy, then the temptation is going to be in every age, and we see this right here in the midst of COVID,
Yep.
To try to talk about every issue in terms of make every issue a theological issue, make every issue a matter of faith, or terminology that's sometimes used now, make it a gospel issue.
Yep.
And so then you're not simply saying, well, here's what we need to do to maintain order in the church. You're saying, well, here's what we need to do, and here's the theological argument for it, and here's why if you don't do it, you're sinning against God, right? So, and that was what happened in the medieval church. There was this very, very elaborate set of rules and regulations governing so many areas of Christian life, and they were all treated as matters of sin and righteousness. And if you broke any of these rules, you had to do penance and so on. And so the reformers recognized the need for people to be governed, but in many areas to be governed with a standard that didn't have eternal consequences, that was simply a prudential standard, that was simply it's probably better to do things this way than that way for the sake of good order. And that's where the Christian magistrate came in, is saying these aspects of the church's life need to be governed, but the way we're governing them is a prudential standard. We're doing it this way here. You can do it that way there. We're not going to elevate this into a theological issue. So I think that kind of distinguishing between matters of faith and matters of wisdom, prudence, good citizenship is every bit as important now as it was then, despite the changed relationships.
So I think we'll get into this later in this conversation in terms of the matters of the conscience, and I think all things that comes out of these discussions is what you're saying. What's a real gospel issue? What's a first order issue, and then what might be described as adiaphora? What is something that we could call it things indifferent or whatever? How does that sort of relationship work? And I think that's going to be important to discuss. If I could ask one last question, just in terms of like your own kind of like personal thoughts on the magisterial reformation before we start to get into some of the nitty gritty of some more application. When we look to this period, this is the 16th century, and we are now living in the 21st. There's obviously a huge gap of time between us and them. And I find, when I look to somebody like a Calvin or Luther or any of the big names that you could think of that we all kind of tend to read, I take all sorts of benefit from them theologically. Their doctrine of God, their Trinity, doctrine of predestination, justification, all those kinds of things. And it seems just easy enough to transport that down to my own day. But I'm finding that a lot of people, when they're kind of confronted with what these reformers are having to say about matters of the magistrate and obedience or disobedience, well, now all of a sudden that's back then. That was them living in this particular time, either the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, however you want to describe it. But that's just not. We live in either a democratic republic or a constitutional monarchy, and our governments are entirely different. So what they have to say to us isn't entirely relevant. So if we look back to the reformers, Protestants, Lutherans, however we want to frame it, and say, yes, their theology is great for me today in terms of doctrine of God. Yet, because politically we're in such a different time than them, can we still find them relevant on these issues? And what would be a couple of key areas that you think are most relevant?
Sure. Well, I think we could just say two things for now. So one is that foundational distinction between matters of faith, matters indifferent, or we could say between matters between the believer and God, and matters that are matters of outward order, or we could say matters of the spiritual kingdom, matters of the civil kingdom. There's different terminology we can use to try to capture different dimensions of that. But there's an important distinction there that remains intact, remains the same, however that earthly kingdom is governed, right? So that what we're talking about here is changes in the way in which the earthly kingdom, the outward ordering of human society functions. But changes, and the reformers knew that. The reformers knew there were monarchies and democracies and aristocracies. Right. There were different kinds of civil government, but they still thought they could talk, and they knew there were governments with Christian magistrates and governments without Christian magistrates. But they still thought they could make some categorical distinctions between the way in which the area of civil life related to the life of the church, properly speaking. So I think we can still apply that absolutely. Another point is that many of the changes that we see now are in fact the outworking of the questions they were wrestling through. I mean, I wrote something on this for the Gospel Coalition Canada in relation to this whole COVID question, which is we live in constitutional republics. We live under the rule of law. And a lot of that is a result of the reformers wrestling with the duty to be subject to the governing authorities. And what do you do if you think the governing authorities are wrong? What do you do if the governing authorities are clearly being oppressive and tyrannical? There has to be some kind of recourse, right? And they wanted to grant that recourse without just saying, be subject to the governing authorities, usually, right? They wanted to have some principled way to do it. And so they thought about the fact that any good system of government includes multiple governing authorities. And the more there can be counterbalancing authorities within a government, the more stable it is. And so from that insight and from that attempt to live out scriptural commands emerges much of the development of modern constitutionalism and the rule of law, and the idea that if your governor tells you to do something and that's in contradiction of the laws of your state, then you're still obeying the governing authorities if you disobey your governor. It's your governor who's disobeying the governing authorities. And we have to be really careful in how we apply that. But in principle, we're subject to laws rather than individuals. And that is itself an outworking of the magisterial reformation.
There you go. Well, that's great. Well, we'll draw this part of our discussion to a conclusion here. Sorry. And what we're going to do next is we'll turn to the question of, what is the more nitty-gritty nature of our obligations as Christians and as churches to obey the civil magistrate. But thank you for kind of just setting a little bit of the stage in terms of what is the magisterial reformation and your interest in it and how it's relevant to us today.
Thank you.